The chandeliers of the grand ballroom at Rosewood Estate did not merely illuminate the night. They bathed 200 of Lexington, Kentucky's most influential elites in a warm, suffocating amber glow. Outside, the rain washed over the bluegrass paddocks of my 200-acre thoroughbred farm. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of $500 vintage Cabernet, expensive French perfumes, and the unspoken arrogance of old Southern money. Senators, horse racing magnates, Wall Street bankers, and high society journalists clinked crystal flutes under high-vaulted neoclassical ceilings, completely unaware of the ground they walked upon. I had spent the last 4 hours down at the primary foaling barn in my weathered canvas jacket and my worn tweed suit, the same suit I had worn when my late wife, Evelyn, and I signed the original deed to this land 35 years ago. A newborn thoroughbred filly had experienced respiratory distress at dusk, and my calloused hands were still stained with the dark, rich earth of the stable yards and the faint smell of cedar shavings. I did not enter my own home through the grand rotunda to seek applause or make a grand statement. I simply stepped into the hall to fetch a clean towel and a hot cup of black coffee before returning to the stables to watch over the foal. But in modern society, a man covered in honest dirt is viewed as an eyesore by those who have never bled for a single dime they spend. As I walked past the marble pillars toward the mahogany staircase, the heavy murmur of classical violin music was suddenly sliced open by the sharp heel clicks of high fashion. My 34-year-old son, Weston, stepped directly into my path, flanked by his wife, Giselle Vance Montgomery, a woman whose family name was synonymous with Manhattan real estate ambition, and whose smile was as cold and engineered as surgical steel. Weston was wearing a $5,000 bespoke velvet tuxedo funded entirely by my family trust, his cheeks flushed with expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. Beside him, Giselle held a crystal glass of aged Napa Valley Cabernet, her eyes narrowing as she took in my muddy leather boots, my frayed tweed collar, and the quiet fatigue etched into the deep lines of my face. The entire ballroom fell into a hushed, expectant silence as she stepped forward, making sure 3 local news cameras and 50 prominent guests were watching her every move. "Look what the rain dragged into our gala," Giselle declared, her voice elevated just enough to shatter the ambient jazz music. With a smooth, practiced flick of her wrist, she tilted her glass and poured the dark red wine directly over the lapels of my tweed suit. The icy liquid soaked through my shirt, cold against my chest, as the dark stain spread like an open wound across the fabric. "You senile old fool," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom, yet maintaining a mask of polite disgust for the crowd. "This is the Vance Montgomery Derby Gala, not a homeless shelter. Security. Get this former barn worker out of our estate and throw him into the rear supply shed before the national press arrives." Before the security guards could even move, Weston stepped up to my face, his breath smelling of 90-proof liquor. Instead of looking away, he reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, and slapped them hard against my chest, letting the notes flutter down into the puddle of spilled wine at my boots. "Take the money, Dad, and get the hell out," Weston whispered loudly enough for the front row of politicians to hear. "Take a cab to some cheap motel out on Interstate 75 and stay there until Sunday. You're an embarrassment. You look like a senile janitor who lost his way. And Giselle's family doesn't need a dirty stable hand ruining our brand on television." If they expected me to yell, to raise my fists, or to plead for dignity in front of the crowd, they showed how little they ever knew about the man whose blood ran in their veins. I spent 35 years sitting on the federal bench, watching desperate, arrogant men destroy themselves because they mistook quiet composure for weakness. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I slowly leaned down, my spine straight despite the heavy ache in my lower back, and picked up the wet $100 bills one by one from the marble floor. I folded the money neatly, creasing the paper between my thumb and forefinger with deliberate mathematical precision, and tucked the stack gently into the front pocket of Weston's velvet tuxedo jacket. I took out a clean linen handkerchief from my pocket, wiped the Cabernet from my chest, and looked into my son's eyes, the same eyes that used to look up at me from a hospital bed when he was 6 years old and terrified of the dark. I offered him a very small, quiet smile, a smile not of defeat but of complete and absolute clarity. "Congratulations on a magnificent evening, Weston," I said softly, my voice calm, low, and steady enough to cut through the heavy silence of the room. "Enjoy your party." As I turned to walk toward the side exit, my eyes swept across the gallery of onlookers who were watching the spectacle. That was when the second knife went deeper than the first. Standing near the grand spiral staircase, holding a gold-plated iPhone mounted on a ring light stabilizer, was my youngest daughter, Chloe, the girl I had personally walked down the aisle, the child whose Ivy League tuition I had paid in full without a single second thought. She wasn't looking at me with sympathy or shame. She was giggling into her phone, live streaming the entire humiliation to her 800,000 social media followers, narrating my degradation with a bright artificial enthusiasm. Guys, you won't believe this. My broke, eccentric dad just tried to crash our elite Derby Eve gala looking like a yard boy, and Giselle literally just threw wine on him. Look at his face. Hit the like button if you think he should go back to the shed. I stood there for 3 seconds under the glare of her phone camera, watching my own daughter trade her father's dignity for digital applause and viral metrics. In that single moment, the last lingering thread of hesitation in my heart snapped cleanly in two. I did not say a word to Chloe. I did not look at Giselle again. I simply walked out the heavy oak side doors, stepping out into the cold, driving Kentucky rain, leaving their laughter and camera flashes behind me in the golden warmth of the ballroom. The walk from the main mansion to my private woodworking shop at the far edge of the estate was nearly half a mile down a dark gravel path lined with ancient white oak trees. The rain poured heavily, soaking through my tweed jacket and chilling me to the bone, but the cold water felt clean compared to the air inside that house. My workshop was a sanctuary built from reclaimed barn timber, a place smelling of dried cedar, linseed oil, and decades of quiet, honest craftsmanship. I unlocked the heavy iron door, pushed it open, and stepped inside, the quiet hum of the storm outside settling into a dull roar against the tin roof. I lit the small wood-burning stove in the corner, pulled off my soaked jacket, and poured myself a cup of stale black coffee from the pot resting on the iron stovetop. On the wall above my workbench hung a framed black and white photograph of my late wife, Evelyn. She was standing right in front of the main house 30 years ago, wearing a simple linen dress, her hands covered in garden soil as she planted the very rose bushes that Giselle's guests were currently trampling under their designer heels. Evelyn was the moral heart of our family, the anchor that kept us grounded when our investments began to grow into millions. When she passed away 4 years ago from cancer, I promised her I would protect our children, that I would give them time to find their footing and learn the value of hard work. For 4 years, I pretended to be a simple, retired old man who preferred living in a workshop and tending to horses, allowing Weston and Giselle to run the estate's day-to-day public image because I thought generosity would breed gratitude. I had allowed them to believe that the wealth was theirs to manage, hoping that responsibility would turn my son into a man. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, after the music at the main house finally died down and the last valet-parked luxury cars pulled away into the night, I walked back up to the house through the mud to retrieve my personal medical records and leather journal from the primary study. The front doors were unlocked, the grand foyer littered with empty champagne glasses, crumpled napkins, and spilled liquor. But as I stepped into the central parlor, my breath caught in my throat and a cold, heavy ache settled deep within my chest. Hanging above the carved stone fireplace had always been Evelyn's master portrait, a massive, oil-painted canvas commissioned on our 30th wedding anniversary, capturing her warmth, her quiet dignity, and the gentle strength that built this farm. It was the centerpiece of our home, the one thing I had explicitly instructed my children never to touch. The portrait was gone. In its place hung a massive, garish, neon-lit acrylic billboard featuring a larger-than-life photo of Giselle posing in a silk gown emblazoned with the bold gold lettering of her new lifestyle brand, the Vance Montgomery Estate, curated by Giselle. I looked down at the floor near the service hallway. Resting against the baseboards, right next to a trash bin filled with dirty party plates, was Evelyn's portrait. The gilded wooden frame was cracked at the corner, and a sharp tear ran right through the canvas near her hands where someone had carelessly shoved a metal clothing rack against it. I walked over, knelt in the quiet darkness of the parlor, and gently brushed the dust and dried champagne off my wife's painted face. I did not shed a single tear. The grief that had weighed down my heart for 4 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by something cold, heavy, and mathematically absolute. They had not just taken my money. They had attempted to erase the woman who made their very existence possible. They believed that because I was quiet, I was powerless. They believed that because I chose humility, I lacked teeth. I picked up the damaged portrait, carried it carefully back to my workshop through the rain, and set it gently against my workbench. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a fountain pen, unlocked the iron safe beneath the floorboards, and opened the ledger containing the master deeds to the Montgomery Family Trust, the private LLCs holding 68% of the estate, and the legal documentation for every bank account funding Weston's lifestyle. The clock on the workshop wall ticked steadily toward 3 in the morning. The quiet storm outside was settling, but in the dark, silent corners of Lexington, the storm I was about to unleash upon my children was only just beginning. In the rear corner of my workshop, concealed behind a wall of stacked white oak timber, sat a reinforced steel door leading down a flight of concrete stairs into a subterranean vault built beneath the farm 30 years ago. I flipped the breaker and warm recessed lights illuminated a private office that no one in my family, not Weston, not Giselle, not Chloe even knew existed. This room did not smell of sawdust or horse feed. It smelled of old leather, heavy bond paper, and cold financial truth. Resting inside the floor and cord steel safe was the master ledger of the Montgomery Family Trust. I held 68% of the voting shares and full ownership of the 200-acre Lexington estate, the historic paddocks, and the underlying commercial real estate holdings across Fayette County. Under the terms of the trust agreement I had drafted after retiring from the federal bench, Weston was merely a conditional beneficiary with limited operational access, serving at my sole discretion. He owned nothing. The grand estate he boasted about to his high society friends, the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway, and the executive title he wore like a crown were entirely dependent on my continued silence. As I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk to pull the master accounts, a sudden spell of dizziness hit me, a familiar, dull fog that had been creeping into the back of my mind over the past 3 months. I had attributed it to grief, fatigue, and the natural weight of passing years. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small plastic amber bottle containing my daily blood pressure medication, prescribed by our longtime family physician. I unscrewed the cap and poured 2 small white round pills into my palm. But as the bright overhead lights struck the surface of the tablets, my eyes caught a subtle irregularity. I had taken this specific prescription for over a decade. The imprint on the authentic tablets was always engraved with a sharp, crisp serial code. These pills were smooth, slightly chalky, and bore no markings at all. My hand froze. A cold sensation, far sharper than the rainwater soaking my clothes, crept down my spine. I stood up, walked over to my desk microscope, a tool I used to examine fine wood grain and antique furniture joinery, and placed one of the tablets under the lens. I crushed a fraction of the pill and ran a basic chemical identification solvent across the compound, a residual habit from my years presiding over federal narcotics cases. Within 90 seconds, the test strip turned a dark, unmistakable violet. It was not antihypertensive medication. It was a compounding mixture of a low-grade sedative and a synthetic anticholinergic compound, a deliberate, slow-acting drug designed to induce short-term memory loss, chronic disorientation, and symptoms mimicking early-stage vascular dementia. Weston hadn't just insulted me at the gala. He hadn't just kicked me out into the rain to protect his wife's ego. He had been systematically poisoning his own father for 90 days. He was not waiting for me to pass away naturally. He was actively engineering a medical paper trail to have me declared legally incompetent, incapacitated by cognitive decline, so that he could petition the Fayette County Probate Court to strip my voting rights and seize absolute control of the Montgomery Family Trust. The discovery of the altered medication shifted everything inside me. The ache in my heart transformed into an absolute unshakable calm. Anger is an emotional luxury for the weak. Mathematical precision is the weapon of a man who intends to settle a debt. I picked up my secure satellite line and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Hank Bear Miller answered on the second ring. Hank was a retired Fayette County Sheriff's Chief Deputy who had served beside me during my years on the federal court. He was a man of few words, heavy shoulders, and unyielding loyalty. 20 minutes later, his unmarked black pickup truck pulled up to the rear gravel lane behind my workshop. Hank stepped through the workshop door without a word, carrying a small Pelican case containing commercial-grade, encrypted surveillance hardware. "Sterling," Hank said, his voice low and gravelly as he looked at the wet, stained tweed jacket hanging over my chair and the crushed pill resting under the microscope. "I heard about the spectacle at the gala tonight. The whole town is talking about how your son's wife treated you." "The spectacle was just the bait, Hank," I replied, pointing to the chemical test results on my desk. "Look at this." Hank leaned over the microscope, his face darkening as he read the analysis sheet. His jaw tightened until the muscles bulged along his neck. "This is attempted manslaughter and elder abuse, Sterling. I can have state troopers at the main house in 15 minutes. "No," I said quietly, setting my hand on his arm. "If the police march in tonight, his high-priced corporate lawyers will tie this up in bail hearings and procedural motions for 2 years. He will blame the pharmacy, blame a rogue maid, or blame my own failing memory. I don't want a legal compromise, Hank. I want absolute, undeniable closure. I want them caught in the exact net they constructed." Over the next 2 hours, while Weston, Giselle, and their remaining guests were celebrating in the main house above, Hank and I executed a silent deployment. Using secondary access keys I had kept since building the estate, we accessed the primary service conduits running beneath the main mansion. Hank installed 3 micro-lens cameras and ultra-sensitive directional microphones inside the ceiling molding of the main study, the exact room where Weston conducted his private business meetings. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the feed was live on the encrypted tablet resting on my vault desk. I put on my glasses, poured a fresh mug of black coffee, and began monitoring the live recordings from the past 48 hours that had been stored on the house's internal server. What I witnessed was far worse than financial greed. It was a cold-blooded slaughter of my life's work. On the high-definition video feed from the previous afternoon, Weston was sitting behind my late wife's mahogany desk, swirling a glass of 20-year-old scotch. Sitting across from him was Giselle and a slick, sharp-suited man named Dominic, a disgraced former Wall Street broker who ran an unregistered offshore cryptocurrency hedge fund out of Miami. "The audit is coming up at the end of the quarter, Weston." Dominic's voice boomed clearly through my headphones. "If your old man wakes up and looks at the master ledger, you're done. You've pulled $4.5 million out of the trust's capital reserve account over the last 8 months to cover your margin calls on those failed Bitcoin leverage trades." Weston didn't flinch. He leaned back in my chair, putting his boots up on the polished wood. "The old man isn't looking at anything, Dominic. His brain is fogged out. He spends all day in the barn talking to horses and carving wood. Giselle's doctor friend has been adjusting his blood pressure supplements for 12 weeks. By the time the Derby Festival ends next week, we'll have the medical board sign the petition for emergency conservatorship." Giselle laughed, filing her nails with an icy composure. "And once the conservatorship goes through, we sign the deed over to the foreign syndicate for $45 million. We take our cut, buy the Gulfstream jet we looked at in Atlanta, and put Sterling into that private care facility down near the Mexican border in El Paso. The one that doesn't allow unannounced family visits. He can spend his remaining years looking at the desert." Chloe walked into the frame, holding her phone. "Hey, just make sure my lifestyle brand sponsorship gets funded out of the closing proceeds. I need $200,000 for the spring launch in Miami." "You'll get your money, Chloe," Weston said with a smirk. "The old man built an empire, but he was too soft to use it. It's our turn now." I sat in the dark vault beneath my workshop, watching my 3 children laugh about shipping their father to a desert facility after stealing $4.5 million of his life savings. My chest did not heave. My hands did not shake. I took off my headphones, laid them neatly beside the tablet, and let out a long, quiet breath. If you were in my shoes, would you have confronted them right there at the party, or remained silent and waited for the legal trap to spring? Comment A for immediate confrontation, or B for patient revenge. At 6:30 on Friday morning, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the misty pastures of Lexington, a dark blue sedan pulled down the private gravel lane behind my workshop. Stepping out of the vehicle was federal attorney Marcus Vance, a legendary legal mind who had spent 30 years prosecuting high-level white-collar fraud before the United States Court of Appeals. Marcus was not just a lawyer. He was an old friend who knew the exact foundation upon which the Montgomery Family Trust had been constructed. I met him at the workshop door, handing him a hot cup of coffee as he carried a heavy leather briefcase inside. We sat down at my desk, surrounded by the smell of cedar and the quiet humming of the wood stove, and laid out the evidence. "They went too far, Sterling," Marcus said, his brow furrowing deeply as he reviewed the chemical analysis of the altered pills, the video footage of the financial conspiracy, and the forensic bank statements showing the unauthorized $4.5 million wire transfers to Dominic's offshore accounts. "This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and felony elder abuse under federal and state statutes. I don't just want them indicted, Marcus," I said softly, my voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of an anvil. "I want every single legal asset they think they possess stripped away before they even realize the court has convened. I want the trap sealed so tightly that not even a shadow can slip through." Marcus pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper, his eyes flashing with sharp professional admiration. "Then we execute under Kentucky Code 386B.4, the Uniform Trust Code provisions governing irrevocable family trusts and fiduciary duties." He pointed his pen to the specific clauses highlighted in yellow. "Because you retained absolute status as the settler and primary managing trustee, and because we now have forensic proof of a severe breach of fiduciary duty and intentional elder abuse, we don't need a lengthy civil trial to strip Weston of his power. Under Section 386B.8, we are filing an emergency ex parte petition with the federal district court this morning." "What does that give us?" I asked. "It gives us 3 immediate devastating levers," Marcus explained, leaning forward. "First, it triggers an immediate, mandatory forensic financial audit over every account, company, and property connected to the Montgomery name. Second, under the elder abuse and fraud revocation clauses, it automatically revokes Weston, Giselle, and Chloe's status as contingent beneficiaries. They are legally disinherited as of 8 o'clock this morning. They no longer have a right to a single cent of this estate, the trust, or your personal holdings." Marcus slid a final document across the table, a crisp, red-stamped order signed by the chief judge of the district court. Third, and most importantly, it grants us an immediate, frozen injunction over all auxiliary credit lines, corporate accounts, and property deeds. As of this exact second, Weston's executive authority is completely dead. He is holding a steering wheel that isn't connected to the engine anymore. I looked at the document, feeling the cool paper beneath my calloused fingers. And the sale of the farm? The $45 million deal they plan to sign with the foreign syndicate during the Derby Gala's final dinner tomorrow night? Marcus smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that held no warmth at all. We let them proceed right up to the final signature. We let them invite their buyers, their investors, their high society friends, and the press. We let them stand at the podium, completely convinced they are about to become millionaires. And right when Weston raises the pen to sign away your life's work, we drop the hammer. Twalfru, drop the name of your city or state in the comments below. Let me know where our community of silent, hardworking fathers is watching from tonight. By Friday afternoon, 24 hours before the grand closing gala, the machinery of my silent retaliation was operating with absolute, unseen perfection. From my subterranean vault, with Marcus sitting beside me and a team of federal forensic accountants working remotely through secured servers, I began systematically severing every financial lifeline my children used to project their false status. First came the corporate black credit cards. Giselle was currently at an ultra-exclusive equestrian boutique in downtown Lexington, accompanied by her entourage of high society wives, attempting to purchase a $24,000 custom diamond necklace for tomorrow night's celebration. With a single keystroke on my terminal, I revoked her authorized user status and placed a security freeze on the merchant account. Through the remote audio feed, I heard the precise moment the trap sprung. The boutique manager politely informed Giselle that her card had been flagged for immediate revocation due to unauthorized corporate usage, forcing her to abandon her luxury items in front of her gossiping peers, her face burning with sudden, unscripted humiliation. Next came Weston's financial lifeline. He had placed a $100,000 earnest money deposit using the trust's primary operational account to lease a luxury private box at the Keeneland racecourse for his foreign buyers. I executed an immediate clawback under the emergency forensic audit order, freezing his corporate liquidity and placing a freeze on his personal accounts pending federal review. Finally, I turned my attention to the main mansion itself. Using the master utility management system registered under my name, I revoked the administrative Wi-Fi access, restricted the automated security gates, and redirected all master estate mail to my private workshop box. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, I stood by the window of my workshop, watching from behind the cedar blinds. A heavy, expensive flatbed tow truck pulled down the main driveway, carrying official impound notices from the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. Because the $85,000 luxury SUV Weston had leased was funded through fraudulent wire transfers from the frozen trust account, the leasing company had issued an immediate repossession order. Weston ran out onto the front porch in his silk shirt, his face pale, waving his hands frantically at the tow truck driver. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you know who I am? I am Weston Montgomery. I run this estate. Drop that vehicle right now or I'll have your license revoked." The tow truck driver didn't even look at him. He simply handed Weston a red-stamped legal notice from the district court, hitched the luxury SUV onto the hydraulic lift, and drove away, leaving my son standing alone in the middle of his grand driveway. Surrounded by the cold Kentucky drizzle, a few minutes later Weston's phone rang. It was his lead accountant, calling to inform him that every corporate card, every credit line, and every bank account associated with the Montgomery name had been completely frozen by an unknown judicial injunction. Through the surveillance microphone mounted in the main hallway, I heard Giselle's sharp, terrified voice ring out from the grand foyer. "Weston, what is happening?" "The caterers just canceled the food orders for tomorrow's gala. The florist said our deposit bounced. My cards are declined everywhere. What did you do?" Weston stood in the center of the parlor, staring blankly at the empty space above the fireplace where his wife's garish advertisement hung, his hands trembling violently as he tried to dial his father's number. In his pocket, his phone buzzed continuously, but I did not answer. My phone rested silently on my desk beside Evelyn's damaged portrait, the screen lighting up with his desperate calls before going dark once again. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, took a seat in my wooden rocking chair by the stove, and looked out at the rain falling over the dark paddocks. The initial phase was complete. They had spent months planning to strip my dignity, my home, and my mind away from me. They had assumed that because an old father remains quiet, he is blind to the world around him. Tomorrow night, at the grand closing gala of the Derby Festival, in front of 200 of the state's most prominent figures, the foreign buyers, and the national press, My children were going to learn the most painful lesson of their lives. They were about to discover that when a quiet man finally decides to speak, his voice does not just fill a room. It tears down kingdoms. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp, heavy chill of late autumn settling over Fayette County. The grand ballroom of the Lexington Grand Hotel was a sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and polished mahogany tables. Over 200 of Kentucky's most powerful figures had assembled: high-stakes thoroughbred breeders, Wall Street hedge fund representatives, local politicians, and national media cameras equipped with high-definition lenses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, $300 champagne, and the toxic arrogance of unearned triumph. At the head of the room stood a massive press riser, flanked by two oversized digital projection screens displaying a rendered graphic of my 200-acre estate. Above the image of my paddocks, my home, and my late wife Evelyn's rose gardens ran a bold golden banner: the Montgomery Estate Acquisition, a new era of luxury. My 34-year-old son, Weston, stood behind the podium wearing a $7,000 tailored tuxedo, a diamond-encrusted watch flashing on his wrist. Beside him stood his wife, Giselle Vance Montgomery, clad in an emerald silk evening gown, her hair sculpted to perfection, her face beaming for the flashing cameras. My youngest daughter, Chloe, was standing near the front row, holding her gold-plated phone, live-streaming the entire affair to her social media followers with a bright, rehearsed smile. Weston raised his crystal glass, the ice clinking softly as the room fell into an eager, expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press," Weston began, his voice amplified across the surround sound speaker system, dripping with theatrical confidence. "Tonight marks the realization of a grand vision. My late mother always dreamed of seeing this estate reach its full financial potential, and my father, who has gracefully stepped back from public life due to his advancing age and failing health, has entrusted me with the stewardship of our family's legacy. Tonight, we sign the final $50 million merger agreement with our international partners, officially transitioning the Montgomery Holdings into a global luxury resort brand." The room erupted into polite, aristocratic applause. Giselle stepped forward, holding a silver tray bearing a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, offering it to the lead representative of the foreign investment syndicate sitting across the table. Weston unscrewed the cap of the pen, holding it high over the 500-page acquisition document for the photojournalists to capture. "To the future," Weston declared, lowering the pen toward the signature line. Before the tip of the nib could touch the paper, the massive 8-foot-tall carved oak doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open with a heavy, booming crash that rattled the crystal chandeliers above. The applause died instantly. 200 heads turned in unison toward the entrance. Stepping through the threshold was not a broken, senile old man in muddy leather boots and a stained canvas coat. I walked into the ballroom wearing a bespoke midnight blue wool suit tailored precisely to my broad shoulders, a crisp white sea-island cotton shirt, and a dark silk tie fastened with absolute mathematical precision. The deep, weathered lines of my face did not convey exhaustion or confusion. They carried the cold, unshakable authority of a man who had presided over the federal bench for 35 years. Walking on my left was Federal Attorney Marcus Vance, carrying a heavy leather briefcase stamped with the official seal of the United States District Court. Walking on my right were two sharp-eyed special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division, their dark suits, brass tie clips, and subtle earpieces radiating an undeniable, lethal authority. Behind us stepped 4 uniformed Fayette County Sheriff's deputies, their leather duty belts creaking softly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the hall. My heavy leather shoes struck the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate cadence. Clack, 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 each step echoing through the room like the striking of a gavel. Weston's hand froze 2 inches above the signature page. The color drained from his face so fast, so completely, that he looked as though he had seen a ghost rising from an open grave. Giselle's practiced smile shattered, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the podium until her knuckles turned ghostly white. I stopped 10 feet from the head table, folded my hands behind my back, and looked directly into my son's eyes. "Put the pen down, Weston," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not shout. I did not raise my pitch. But carried by decades of judicial presence, my low, quiet baritone cut through the silence of that ballroom like a razor through silk, freezing every soul in the room. "Dad?" Weston's voice cracked, dropping an octave into a high-pitched, desperate squeak that was picked up by every microphone in the hall. What are you doing here? Security. Why is he here? He's confused. He's supposed to be at his residence." Special Agent Miller of the FBI stepped forward, extending his arm toward the house security guards who were hesitating near the perimeter. "Federal agents. Nobody moves, nobody touches those documents, and nobody leaves this room." Marcus Vance stepped up to the audio-visual control console near the stage. Without asking for permission, he plugged an encrypted silver flash drive directly into the master broadcasting deck. Members of the press and distinguished guests, Marcus's voice boomed over the room's sound system. Before any documents are signed tonight, the United States District Court requires the disclosure of the true status of the Montgomery Family Trust. The rendered graphic of the luxury resort on the two massive projection screens vanished instantly. In its place, the high-definition video surveillance feed from my study flashed onto the displays in 40-foot resolution. The crystal-clear audio roared through the ballroom speakers. The entire audience watched and listened as Weston sat in my late wife's chair, swirling scotch, boasting about stealing $4.5 million from my retirement reserves to cover his failed cryptocurrency margin calls. "The old man isn't looking at anything, Dominic." Weston's recorded voice echoed loudly across the ballroom, shocking the politicians and businessmen who had just been applauding him. "His brain is fogged out. Giselle's doctor friend has been adjusting his blood pressure supplements. By the time the Derby Festival ends next week, we'll have the medical board sign the petition for emergency conservatorship. We put Sterling into that private care facility down near the Mexican border in El Paso. He can spend his remaining years looking at the desert." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the 200 guests. Women covered their mouths in disbelief. Prominent horse breeders shook their heads in absolute disgust. Next on the screen flashed the forensic bank statements, highlighted in bright red, 64 unauthorized wire transfers, the chemical toxicology reports proving my blood pressure medication had been systematically replaced with cognitive sedatives, and the certified judicial order signed at 8 o'clock that morning under Kentucky Code Graph 386B.4. Marcus looked at the international buyers sitting at the table. As of 8 a.m. yesterday, Mr. Weston Montgomery was legally stripped of all trustee authority, disinherited from the estate, and stripped of all voting shares due to felony breach of fiduciary duty and intentional elder abuse. Any contract signed by his hand is legally void, fraudulent, and subject to federal prosecution. The lead representative of the foreign syndicate stood up, shoved his papers into his briefcase without saying a single word to Weston, gave me a respectful nod of apology, and walked out of the hall flanked by his security team. No, this is a mistake. This is an AI fabrication. He's trying to ruin me," Weston screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he slapped his palms against the podium, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. Special Agent Miller stepped onto the stage, pulling a pair of heavy stainless steel peerless handcuffs from his belt. "Weston Montgomery," Agent Miller declared in a flat, factual voice that echoed off the high ceilings, "you are under arrest by authority of the United States government for wire fraud under 18 U.S. Code Graph 1343, bank fraud under 18 U.S. Code Graph 1344, and felony elder financial exploitation under Kentucky Revised Statutes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Snap, clink. The metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Weston's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. Giselle let out a sharp, pierced shriek, backing away from her husband, as if his touch were contagious. She grabbed her designer leather handbag from the chair and turned to bolt toward the private service exit near the rear. "Mrs. Montgomery, stop right there," a female FBI agent barked, stepping into her path. "Get your hands off me," Giselle shrieked, her face contorted in a mask of ugly, hysterical rage. "I am a Vance. My family owns real estate in Manhattan. I had nothing to do with his business. I didn't sign anything. Every luxury item, every piece of jewelry, and that handbag in your hands were purchased directly using wire-transferred funds from the stolen trust account," the agent replied coldly, taking the bag from her hands and placing a forfeiture tag on it. "All personal assets acquired through the proceeds of wire fraud are subject to immediate federal asset forfeiture. You are named as a co-conspirator in the federal indictment. Step forward." Before the eyes of her high society peers, the press cameras, and the guests she had sought to impress, Giselle's wrists were pulled behind her back, and steel cuffs were locked securely into place over her diamond bracelets. Chloe stood near the front row, her phone slipping from her fingers and smashing against the marble floor. She looked at me, her face pale, her lip trembling as she realized her online brand, her funding, and her social standing had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. She tried to step toward me, reaching out a hand, but the cold, quiet stare I gave her stopped her dead in her tracks. The sheriff's deputies began clearing the room, escorting the stunned, whispering guests toward the exits while photojournalists snapped dozens of high-resolution photographs of Weston and Giselle being led away in federal custody. As Agent Miller guided Weston down the stage steps toward the side exit, my son's composure completely collapsed. The arrogance, the smug velvet tuxedo posture, and the cold disdain he had displayed at the gala 2 nights ago vanished into thin air, replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a child who had finally realized the world was not going to protect him from his own sins. Weston stumbled over his own feet, dragging his polished shoes against the carpet, and dropped hard onto his knees right at my feet. The handcuffs clinked against the marble floor. Tears streamed down his cheeks, smearing his expensive collar as he lifted his bound hands toward me, trying frantically to grab the hem of my midnight blue suit jacket. "Dad, Dad, please!" Weston sobbed, his voice cracking into jagged, desperate gasps that echoed through the emptying hall. "Please, Dad, don't do this to me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we can handle this inside the family. I'm your son, Dad. I'm your only son. You raised me. Mom would never want you to put me in prison. Please, Dad. I'm begging you. Tell them to take these cuffs off." I stood entirely still. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I looked down at the 34-year-old man weeping on his knees in front of me, the boy I had taught to ride horses in the green paddocks, the boy whose Ivy League tuition I had paid, the man who had sat in my home 48 hours ago and planned to ship his father to a desert care facility after stealing his life's work. I felt no surges of anger. I felt no burning desire for vengeance. What I felt in that moment was a vast, quiet, profoundly heavy sorrow, a grief for the child he used to be, and an absolute clarity regarding the monster he had become. I slowly leaned down, my spine straight, bringing my face close to his ear so that only he could hear the words I was about to say. "When you poured that wine over my suit on Thursday night, Weston," I whispered, my voice as calm, steady, and cold as deep winter ice, "you told your friends that an old man's dignity has no value. You taught me that respect must be paid for. Today, my son, you are going to pay your bill." Weston's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing terror as he realized that the soft, forgiving father he had exploited for 4 years no longer existed. The man standing over him was the federal judge who had sworn an oath to uphold justice without fear or favor. I stood back up, smoothed the lapels of my dark suit, and looked at Agent Miller. "Take him away, Agent," I said softly. Weston screamed my name one last time. "Dad, Dad!" As the federal agents pulled him up by his arms and escorted him out the heavy oak service doors into the cold Kentucky night, where the red and blue emergency lights of 3 federal cruisers were flashing against the dark glass of the hotel entrance. The sun was setting by the time I returned to the 200-acre estate in Lexington. The rain that had battered the Bluegrass Hills for 3 days had finally stopped, leaving the evening air sharp, clean, and carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp cedar and wet earth. The grand mansion at the top of the hill was dark and silent. There were no valet-parked cars, no classical violin orchestras playing in the rotunda, no social media cameras flashing in the halls, and no arrogant voices laughing over stolen champagne. I pulled off my dark suit jacket, draped it neatly over the passenger seat of my vintage pickup truck, and walked down the gentle slope toward the private wooden dock extending over the estate's quiet, mirror-like lake. The sky above the Kentucky hills was painted in deep, dramatic hues of copper, amber, and indigo. The reflection of the ancient white oak trees stretched across the still water, undisturbed by the wind. I walked to the very end of the wooden dock, where my late wife Evelyn and I used to sit on summer evenings 30 years ago, watching our children chase fireflies in the tall pasture grass. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, crisp evening air fill my lungs, air that no longer carried the suffocating weight of deceit, betrayal, or silent endurance. I sat down on the wooden bench, resting my calloused hands on my knees, and pulled out my old pocket watch. The one Evelyn had given me on the day I was sworn onto the federal bench. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the mechanical gears was the only sound in the vast, peaceful quiet of the countryside. Tack, tick, tack. Many people who watch a story like mine unfold ask the same question. How could a father do that to his own blood? How could a man allow his own son to walk away in handcuffs? Do you not feel regret? Do you not feel the urge to soften the blow? I look out at the copper light reflecting off the water, and my answer is always the same. Not for a single second. A father's ultimate duty to his children is not to shield them from the painful realities of the world. It is not to surrender his own dignity, his honor, and his life's labor so that his offspring can live in unearned luxury and arrogant entitlement. A soft heart without firm boundaries is not love. It is negligence. It is an open invitation for those you care about to ruin their own souls. I gave my son 34 years of unconditional support. I gave him a name respected across this state, an education paid for in full, a home to shelter his family, and a second chance when he failed. What I failed to give him sooner was a consequence. When you allow a child to cross sacred lines without facing the weight of their choices, you do not protect them, you destroy them. You turn them into predators who believe the world owes them everything, and that human dignity can be stepped on without a cost. Sometimes, the greatest, most profound act of love a father can perform is to step out of the way, lower the shield, and let the cold, unyielding hammer of the world strike his children down until they hit rock bottom. because only at rock bottom, stripped of their false status, their stolen wealth, and their arrogant illusions, can they finally learn what it means to be a human being. Real family justice is never loud. It does not shout in anger, it does not throw fits in the street, and it does not seek petty vengeance. It is quiet, it is patient, it is mathematically certain. To every silent, hardworking father watching tonight from your living rooms, your workshops, your trucks, and your quiet farms across this nation, do not apologize for drawing your line. Do not allow your kindness to be mistaken for weakness, and never let your soft heart become a carpet for ungrateful hands to walk upon. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Your life's labor is sacred. Take care of yourselves, gentlemen. Keep your boundaries firm, keep your conscience clean, and sleep well tonight. Because when a quiet father finally decides to draw the line, the whole world backs up.